What about this sense of more Eastern philosophy balance? When I think of something like the FBI, I think of FBI that did COINTELPRO, but I also think about the FBI that arrests white supremacists actively trying to do bombings. So I have to have some balance in this world, because I think the reason that the white supremacists want the FBI gone right now is so that they can do whatever they want. Same thing with the Department of Education. I used to be very extremist about it. I used to say we should shut it down, the whole thing. But now when I think about things like special education, Title I, Title VI, Title IX, IDEA, keep going down the list on all these things that they say they will send back to the states. I mean, look what they're doing already right now with the power that they have. You know, if there wasn't some sort of federal oversight, this is the balance for me. The federal government has not been our friend. And at the same time, the federal government is the only thing that has been our final backstop when states are taking our rights away from us. It's 2025. We can't keep teaching radical Afrocentrism the way we taught it 50 years ago and try and make everybody wear a beret and go like running through the streets with Molotovs and stuff. Like, this is 2025.
It is Freedom Friday and you are still not free.
And right now, what I'm making of this moment that I think is so pressing and so important to talk about is that there is a very big push from the right to change education drastically, cut the Department of Education, change the way that schools teach, history and patriotism. Lots of threats about taking money away from schools if they don't do certain things. So it's this big push. And, many of us for the longest time have said there needs to be some big changes in education. So you would think that this would be our moment, except for it doesn't mean that you just go joining anybody's movement for big change. Yes, there might need to be some changes to the Department of Education, but does that really mean that we should chop the whole thing down? Yes, public education needs some changes, but does that mean we should privatize the whole thing, right? It puts us in the middle, because I think all of us, and I don't want to speak for you two, but we have been radical in some of our beliefs, but we don't want to be radically stupid, right? So in a moment like this, we're kind of in a bind, because on one side, there are people that will defend the system at all costs, and there's another group who will try and tear it down at all costs. So how do we make sense of this, brothers? We're in the middle of this moment as radical Black education thinkers. How do we navigate those two sides right now?
Yeah, man, it's so much. And as you said, there's, I think there's always extremes on, the extreme desire to maintain status quo and keep things just safe and middling and beneficial to the few. And then there's others who, what they say in the Batman movie, they just want to watch the world burn and make sure that they still protect the very few. And I don't know, I've always thought that, the pragmatic revolutionary aspect, often brought you to the middle. And then just culturally, as black people, even our revolution is centered in love. Our revolution's never been centered in hate. I think that's my analysis as I've grown up and grown older. Is just that just keeps coming back to the forefront for me, that there are revolutions that are grounded in love and care and humanity, and can be, looked at as radical, but only in a sense because love is looked at as radical these days, because there's so much hatred, there's so much violence, there's so much vile language and behavior. But I think that yes, things could be radically shifted and shaped in a more beautiful way, as opposed to radically done in a hateful, spiteful, racist, ignorant way.
What do you think, Ish? How you maintain your radical card at this moment without joining the right wing?
That is interesting that you bring it up, because, I've even noticed ever since, COVID, some of the political alignment within this country kind of shifted, right? I never thought I would see, the left demand the FBI be kept together, and other calls for
I ain't
war.
necessarily joined in that group.
But that's how fraught it is.
Yeah. Strange bedfellows, right?
Strange bedfellows. And, I remember, back in the day, all the, with 9/11 and all the conspiracy theorists there, and how that bled into what is now, the modern right that makes up, Trump's Republican Party. And it's really interesting that some of those ideas have leaked into like the not trusting government has mixed in with that government needs to be small enough to drown in a bathtub. You know what I mean? And then you have this like unholy alliance also with the evangelicals, right? The white evangelicals. And you have all this like toxic mix of things. And it's hard to like even parse out which route is good because you're right. The status quo has not been doing good, right? The Department of Education gives out much needed resources, but let's keep it a bean. It hasn't been 100% for Black folks. And those are the type of things that we have to deal with. But at the same time, not having these things and not having anything in its place with rhetoric of those people who are pushing for these things, that's when it gets very troubling. It's like you don't know which way to go, which way to, co-sign, because it's all over the place right now.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, there are two things that make me think of. One, the conversation we've had for a really a decade, Chris. Do we want education reform or do we want to have a revolution? Right? You would always talk about like, what's reform going to do? Like, forget the reform. Like the things are so bad for our children that we need something more than eating around the edges of your cream of wheat, because it's too hot.
I used to go a little far with it, though. I used to say, like, you can't reform slavery.
Yeah,
that's right. Nobody ever talked about slavery reform. Like, hey, how about if we have slavery reform? How about if we just like instead of working 12 hours a day, how about if we work 11 hours and 59 minutes instead of,
yeah.
I
couldn't remember exactly, reform. But I knew it would jog your, Yeah, no, I mean, but that was so powerful when you used to, frame it in that way, because that is, even when Maya Angelou used to say that, like literacy, of our children, for example, and she said we should bring the same energy to end illiteracy that we brought to end enslavement. And when you think about that, and in the context of how you describe, reform or revolutionizing things, like when have we ever had from Department of Ed or anybody else that level of energy to end illiteracy as we had in this country to end enslavement? So what would that look like? What would that mean? And then at the same time, the most unifying thing in this country is anti-Blackness. So you can get all the fellows in the bed at some level because they all share their, their feelings, their hatred, and their ignorance towards, the group that has always been like, you can't talk about equity and justice. You can't talk about this American dream if you're not thinking about how we're situated in this country. It's hypocritical, right? Like, and so those two things are continue to be part of the conversation.
I mean, if you link several things together from our own past, we've been told lots of times different versions of this. So one, only a fool turns over their kids to their enemy and expect them to get educated. So if you consider that as like a stake in the ground, okay, that's one of our intellectual pillars. Let's put that
harsh
down.
And true, right?
Yeah, harsh and true. And that's a pillar. So what's our next pillar after that? My next pillar after that is stolen a little bit from Marxism, which is you have to own the means of education. So in Marxism, it's you got to own the means of production if you want the full value of your labor. But in education, you have to own the means of education if you want the full value of the knowledge, right? Because someone else putting the Black intellect into the hands of someone else is a surefire way to make sure that you won't have all the agency you need to actually produce the type of people you want to produce, right? Black folks. So, on number one, it's don't hand over your kids. Number two, it's own the process. How your teachers come to be, how your classrooms come to be, how your curriculum comes to be. Now, that's a big, heavy task because we've got our kids in mainstream public school systems where we're constantly fighting all those things about what will the curriculum be, what books will they read, all that sort of thing. We wouldn't have to fight those if we had a nation of freedom schools, for instance, right? We would own the means of our own education. So that's two pillars for me right there. I think the next pillar for me is this is the third one I might throw out back to you guys, because this one is what we were just talking about. How do you understand radical complexity? Because it's easy to go radical right or radical left or militant to a fault or suicidal, revolutionary suicide. It's easy to have illusions and romances about going all the way. But what about this sense of what about this sense of more Eastern philosophy balance? What about thinking of, when I think of something like the FBI, I think of FBI that did COINTELPRO, but I also think about the FBI that arrests white supremacists, that are actively trying to do bombings. So I have to have some balance in this world, because I think the reason that the white supremacists want the FBI gone right now is so that they can do whatever they want. Right. I don't think that Trump or any of those folks want to get rid of the FBI because they don't want it to do COINTELPRO on us. I think they want to get rid of the FBI because that's the first one that will investigate them when they do bad things. And it already has. Same thing with the Department of Education, right? I used to be very extremist about it. I used to say we should shut it down, the whole thing. But now when I think about things like special education, Title I, Title VI, Title IX, IDEA, keep going down the list on all these things that they say they will send back to the states. Can you imagine being a child in Mississippi if everything is sent back to the states, Arkansas, Alabama, whatever, versus being in Massachusetts or Nevada or some other state where things are a little bit more advanced?
That's a whole lot of vouchers.
I
We
mean,
could do a whole lot of that.
I mean, look what they're doing already right now with the power that they have. If there wasn't some sort of federal oversight, I think a lot of this is the balance for me. The federal government has not been our friend. And at the same time, the federal government is the only thing that has been our final backstop when states are taking our rights away from us. So that third part for me is just like radical or Eastern version of balanced. I'd throw that back to y'all. If you had to teach, it's 2025. We can't keep teaching radical Afrocentrism the way we taught it 50 years ago and try and make everybody wear a beret and go like running through the streets with Molotovs and stuff. Like, this is 2025. So would you say still push for the radical, revolutionary suicide, or push for this Eastern balance?
First, I would say, like Malcolm said, by any means necessary, right? It's going to take a bunch of them things.
Okay, let me stop you right here. Let me stop you just right here, just for 1 second. Let me just stop you for 1 second. Because this is something that's coming up for me in lots of other conversations. It's like when I talk about Jesus, sometimes I'll ask people which Jesus. So when I talk about Malcolm now, it's like, am I talking about early Malcolm? Am I talking about middle Malcolm, Malcolm in the middle? Or I'm talking about near end Malcolm? Because I think I'm pushing from middle Malcolm to near end Malcolm right now.
Yeah. Well, and also I got to say, when it comes to Malcolm's philosophy, a lot of the times, especially middle to end Malcolm, it's more of like a shift, more of like a correction of thinking, right? Less than the changing of like fundamental truths that he believed in and values he believed in. But I would say it takes all that, right? We need the radical, right? We need the person quietly, like, protecting someone's job in a certain position, right? We need the person that is just like quietly supporting it on TV. You know what I mean? And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we don't allow that full kind of like, aspect of humanity, work itself out. Trying to say that, a radical's this or a radical's that. To me, a radical is someone who gets to the root of things, to find out what exactly that they're dealing with and try to deal with that issue that's causing the problem. And the root for me, and I always contend this, has been white supremacy from the jump, right? That's always been the enemy. It's always been there, right? And I think when we shift the conversation, we're like, oh, well, we can't be radical anymore because that's done a disservice. And it's like, well, that's the only reason we're even right now sitting together and having this level of conversation about liberation and what that potentially looks like, right? That type of conversation just doesn't come out the blue, right? It comes out of an intellectual legacy and tradition that folks developed, have from other thoughts and ideas that will blend into other thoughts of ideas moving down the line. Because I do agree that we have to refine tactics, but at the same time, don't do a disservice to the full, scope of our humanity by not allowing, by not realizing or recognizing that we need all and everything when it comes to getting our liberation.
Okay, give me just like, give me 15, 20 seconds on, for our audience's purposes, what we mean by early Malcolm, middle Malcolm, and near end Malcolm. Like, if I'm saying that, what would I tell people that means exactly?
Well, I'm assuming you're starting early Malcolm, the Hustler.
Yeah,
Red.
like Detroit
Okay.
Red. What was
Yeah.
his name?
Yeah, Detroit Red.
Detroit Red. Yeah.
And because arguably you can start, if you start Malcolm as a child, at being raised by Garveyites, some people start there. But I was assuming that you were starting Red, and then you have Malcolm Early Nation, right? And then you had Malcolm, Post Nation, the last about 2 years of his life. And I would say that during that point, people always point out, and the movie does this too, which is, I think, a disservice to really Malcolm's legacy, what he was doing at the end of his life, his trip to Mecca, right, being a milestone in shaping his, reshaping his worldview into accepting whites. Which is actually really oversimplification of the complex travels that he was doing internationally at the time, trying to hold the U.S. accountable for crimes against humanity, for the mistreatment of Black people in America, while at the same time visiting African leaders. Most of his time traveling across the world was in African countries, not in Mecca. He only did that for a brief time for the Hajj. So it just shows you. And even then, there was pushback about him even being allowed into the country. So I think Malcolm grew and his perspective grown wider, but at the same time, his values, his commitment to the liberation of Black folks remained steadfast through mid Malcolm and then late Malcolm, if you know what I'm saying. There's a bridge that you can make from there. Even during the nation, he was about that life.
This is where the balancing comes in, though, because there's this idea that he was bending one direction and King was bending another direction, that were coming closer to each other. Right, King was starting to become a little bit more fiery radical, like, hey, maybe some of this integration stuff maybe this ain't it. And Malcolm was starting to see things more from a global perspective. Hey, maybe this, urban version, this urban American version of things isn't the global version of things, like Africa and other parts of the world. We're all connected, the brotherhood of man. So that's a simplified version. But I'm only saying that to say, with both of those that I just mentioned, King and Malcolm, there's this sense of chilling for a moment and really thinking more broadly about how I could get everything I've wanted to get done all along. How might I advance it now that I'm maturing and aging? And I think about that for us right now, as we're in the middle between left wing and right wing politics, that neither of which are ours. Neither one of those are ours. And we've got some of our people on both sides. Well, we got more of our people on one side than the other.
Define people.
There you go. There you go. What's a person?
Or define my people, I should say.
Yeah.
But no, I think this reminds me like Reconstruction. You had like the Freedmen's Bureau. You had, Frederick Douglass trying to, during the Civil War leading up, and then afterwards with trying to negotiate with Abraham Lincoln and push him to think about things more expansively, and Lincoln also having his actual advisors, pushing for other things. And, you have Black folks who are in all types of spaces, Frederick Douglass recruiting folks, including his own son, to join the, coming up to Camp William Penn up here in PA and become a soldier. And you had others who are like, yo, stay out of that. Let white folks be white folks and do their thing. And let's just figure out independently how to do that. I think just how, we're in such a unique position as Black people in America, because we are critical aspects of it and a minority of it. A lot of our work has to be done with others. When I was thinking, when you said early Malcolm, I was thinking about his, one of his big regrets was, when the white girl asked her, like, hey, what can we do? And you're like, nothing. Then later he was like, you know what? There's actually a whole list of things that you can do,
Yeah. See, that's my difference. There you go, right there. That's the difference between the radical and the practical.
Yeah. Being a pragmatic revolutionary, I think, has a lot of, it brings heat, because you're like looking at like, how do we move? Because strategy requires decisions. Strategy requires not this, not that. Oh, I'm gonna move this way, I'm gonna move that way. Maybe not me, but I'm going to support the other person that's doing it, right? Like, it requires all of that. And, one of my favorite stories to tell is like, people talk about Harriet Tubman, but very few people know about Ben Ross, her father. Today, all the, I shouldn't make fun of like the manifest, look, manifest, but just there's a
Now
group of
make fun
folks.
of them.
Yeah,
It's worth it. It's worth it.
it is. It does give chuckles. There's a group of folks who Ben Ross would be labeled a sellout, a coon. He does, because white people trusted him. He was known to have never told a lie to his enslavers or their ilk. So he had the horse and carriage. He was able to travel here and there. He was like a foreman, so to speak, if you can have a foreman for enslavers. But as he was traveling, who did he have with him often? He had Harriet, who was showing her the tributaries of the water, who was showing her the berries and how to move in Maryland and all these spaces, right? So much so that even when she came back to visit him, and she eventually like freed him and his mother, but when she came back to visit him, one of the times he put a blindfold around his eyes, just so, because he knew they were going to ask him, "Did you see your daughter?" Because some more people escaped, and we were hearing that Harriet was on this plantation. He just wanted to be able to say, "I never laid eyes on her." So he went out of his way to blindfold himself and hid in the smokehouse for her to come, and they converse and blah, blah, blah. And when he was questioned, he's like, "I never laid eyes on her." Right. But so like, it's like, as you and Ish both, remarked, there's so many ways to be in this movement, but organized strategy and unification still has to be the root, and which means love, right? Even after enslavement, out of love, we wanted public schools in the South. That was out of love.
As I get older, I'm starting to love process, though.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
well, that's a critical part of organizing, right?
Right. And what you just said, what I was thinking when you were talking, the difference between Harriet and her father, to me, there's something attractive and romantic about the big wild revolutionary who goes all out in a blazing, thing of glory, whatever. Like you're watching some, gangster movie or something, all out. Like there's something alluring, attractive about that. There's something very less attractive about doing the actual work and not just fantasizing about being the radical who makes the big moment, but the person, like we had Bob Moses types in our life who the strategy is everything, and people don't do strategy well, right? Charles Houston, the attorney behind the Brown stuff, whatever. He wasn't trying to be out there. He was trying to strategize a big change, like a big structural change. Well, that's boring. No one's walking around trying to be Charles Houston necessarily, because that's less alluring. But I'm overselling it when I say that. Of course there are people that, but in every walk of life, strategy is not easy for people to do. Strategy is its own kind of its own talent, I think, its own discipline. But when you say practical revolutionaries, that makes me think of, how are we going to feed our people? Well, how many of them are there? What are our resources? How can we get things to people? Whatever. How can we take care of the material needs of our people? Now, that doesn't sound like a revolutionary, but you know what? That's the part that people skip when they look at all of our revolutionary figures, is that they were trying to find ways. I mean, listen, today, in this day and age, the idea that you would start a breakfast program shouldn't be all that damn hard for you. The idea that you would start a community health clinic today versus when they were doing it back then, right? But they were saying, if we're going to ask you to boycott, we got to get you rides. If we're going to have you boycott the buses, we got to make sure you can get rides to work. So that's the hard work, right? If we're going to ask you to come march on DC, we're going to have to figure out how we get 250,000 people to DC with the rotary phone, right? Now, what you remember, not you personally, but what America remembers is the I Have a Dream speech. They don't ever think about the thought, well, these people didn't even have any email. How did they get 250,000 people to DC? Through unions and networks and churches and whatever, which brings me to something else too. Unions. All right. So listen, one of the things that you brought up, Sharif, is that there's this lawsuit. The NEA and the ACLU are suing the Trump administration over his DEI, over his anti-DEI Dear Colleague letter. For those listening, a Dear Colleague letter is a letter that the Department of Education sends throughout the nation to let schools and school districts and school leaders know how they will interpret the law. meaning here's some guidance, here's some guidelines, because if you step outside of these things that these guidelines we're telling you right now, we could sue you because by the way that we interpret law. So in this, this is a change because in previous years, through Obama and Biden and other presidents, it has been to tell school districts, this is how we interpret the civil rights law. And if you are abridging the civil rights of students, we will apply this law to you. This is the opposite now. These new guidance are basically saying if you go too far in trying to do the diversity, equity, inclusion thing, and by too far, I mean if you at all imperil white students while you're doing this, we will come after you for discrimination against white students. So this is the white grievance movement in full effect with the president and everything. The NEA and the ACLU have filed a lawsuit challenge that letter, saying that it violates constitutional rights, it limits academic freedom, and it imposes these vague legal restrictions. And by vague, you can say something very vague so that it can mean anything. Like, you can so you could come and hold a district accountable for something that you didn't specify was exactly wrong, but they should have known is kind of the idea. And basically, everybody's seeing this as an attack on inclusive education that started after 2021 with this big wave of like anti-public education politicians deliberately misinterpreting what diversity, equity, and inclusion is and does. What do you guys think about this lawsuit, about us? Some of us have not been the biggest friends of unions for years, but the reason I had a conversion over the last couple of years was I made the calculation that if anybody with a big membership and money was going to challenge this administration, it was going to be the unions. It was going to be the teachers' unions. As much as listen, we got beef maybe, but our beef is smaller than our collective interest right now. They got people, they got money, they got budgets, they got infrastructure, and they are standing up against this administration. Who else is doing that?
And you know what? I mean, even before then, like, one of the things that I think is important to remember just historically, I'm trying to make sure I don't have it wrong, but the NEA was critical in fighting against school segregation as well. So it's not it's not their first rodeo, right? And obviously everyone's familiar with the ACLU, so I think, even beyond this moment, like there's a history of, educators being in the space to, fight for justice. And so I'm glad that, there's multiple lawsuits, right? Like there's the Dear Colleague letter, folks are, against that. There's the portal, the snitch, the anti, justice.
Okay,
snitch
let's just
campaign.
stop for a second and tell people what that is. If you're listening, the snitch portal is a government website that has been set up so that teachers, parents, and students can rat out any teachers that are teaching something that falls in the category of divisive concepts or, equity stuff. So if you hear something in your classroom, go tell the government through this website, this portal. Now, what I would say to everybody listening to this, it certainly would be a shame, and I would never suggest anybody do this, if people just made it their duty every day to put false claims into that portal so that it gets like clogged up with junk every day, like they did to a similar portal in Virginia. I'm not saying that anybody should do that. I'm just saying, wow, wouldn't that be interesting if that happened? That everybody just went in every day and put weird, crazy stuff into that portal. That would be, I'm not saying nobody should do that. I'm just saying that would be interesting to me if that happened.
It is a precedent. Like you're just talking on the historical fact. Like
just for educational purposes only. What if that happened? Wow, that would just be different. That would be weird if people just gutted it with junk and stuff. I wouldn't say you should do that. I just think that would be interesting to see, like, if it happened, right? Anyways, so I'm sorry, keep going, Sharif. I stopped you on that one. I just wanted to explain.
No. I mean, it's
the portal.
So it's all of, all the things. And, it reminds me like W.B. Du Bois had talked about, like, yes, we must complain and not complain like the whining complaint. He was talking about like complain, plain, blunt complaint, ceaseless agitation, unfailing exposure of dishonesty and wrong. This is the ancient, unerring way to liberty, and we must follow it, right? And so from all the angles, from wherever we are, like, in organized ways, in systematic ways. And as you said, I think you laid out a really important piece that I don't want to gloss over, that it's not just about burning things down or fighting against something. if you're not thinking about how to build something, you have a gap, you have a chasm, and unfortunately, those who are most organized and powerful will often go into that gap, and then you find yourself in the same situation just with a different name, right? And so, like, you really have to think about all the things. And when we were young, they used to tell us, like, if you can't feed and clothe yourself, you have no revolution anyway. Right? Like, so what does that mean to have that level of independence, self-determination, but also, as you said, like, how do we feed the people in the midst of all of this? How are we supporting people in the midst of all this? How are we educating people in the midst of all of this? Like, so it's more complicated than this, like, just, as you say, fiery, just, I just want to, like, set things on fire and burn it down. Da, 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 da. Like, it's so much more complicated than that. So much more thoughtful and deliberate, which is exactly the opposite of what we're seeing right now, right? Like, it's one thing to say, hey, Department of Ed or any other agency, like, it's become so bureaucratic, it can't serve the people well. Let's look at it. Let's be thoughtful. Let's hear the insights of people, and not just the aggrieved billionaire.
Yeah, let's have a process.
Yeah, let's have a process about what this looks like, think, and then have shared goal. That sounds what they always talk about, democracy, than what they often do. But this is, again, a pattern, right? Like, that's what they say. How you export in democracy when the hypocrisy of trying to export something that you don't do is crazy.
So, Ish, a couple of things about this. That this is just jarring my memory in so many ways. A lot of we just talked about a bunch of different people in our history. Garvey has come up, Malcolm has come up, King has come up, Harriet Tubman has come up, her father has come up. We've talked about Bob Moses. We can keep going down the list. And one of the
always
things
turns
that
into a history show.
Well, listen, the world is based on history, right? Like, you don't have a reality without history. So, and you really don't have a reality without accurate history. But my point in bringing them up is we often teach it in ways where we're teaching about them at the climactic moment, right? So we're teaching about Nat Turner at the climactic moment. So we get people wanting to live the movie scene. They want to live the movie scene of that person's life without seeing everything that came before the movie scene, the big scene where you, like, set everything on fire or whatever. But why was I saying that? So I was bringing that up just for two reasons. I'm going to test this out on you. Number one, when I think about all of those ancestors, if I thought about what they would be telling us to do, almost 100% of what I could come to is they would be telling us education should be independent. Like, we should own it, we should run it, we should have full control of it, because they were all people that had to do that. They were all people that knew not to trust something outside of themselves to learn to read, or to learn, how to understand history or poetry and all that stuff. So I wonder if you think that's true, is that if you looked at the sum total of all of our ancestors, you brought them today and formed a council of them, everybody from Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and Du Bois and all of them, and had them on a council today, they probably would say, Du Bois died in Africa, they probably would say that you need to have Afrocentric schools set aside from the others. So I'm testing that idea on you. Maybe so maybe I don't know about that. And then what do you think about stopping teaching their climactic moments and start teaching their processes? Start teaching how they formulated their ideas rather than the big moment that they may have had. So I know I gave you a lot there, but it's just two things, there.
Well, that first thing, I'm a little hesitant to touch.
Why?
Let's just say that I think it has a role and it is important. I don't know if there will be enough collective will to make it as large as it needs to be. Now, for the second bit, do you mind rewinding that second?
Yeah,
bit
the second
again?
one. The second one was more about how about if we start teaching these critical thinkers, these essential thinkers, in ways that doesn't just teach their climactic moment, but teaches their process.
Well, I would argue we don't really teach those thinkers, right? We place them as like Malcolm versus Martin, Du Bois versus Booker T, right? And we actually don't look at the nuances and overlaps of their philosophies and the differences and where they come together and everything. And I think that by not doing that just normally, even just having a conversation about that's what needs to be done, we don't know what that looks like. I think that That's one thing I emphasized in my class to make sure that students were fully aware of the intellectual genealogy that informs a leader, and then even the historical contention between folks, right, of like what needs to be done. And I just read this great article that was in Ebony Magazine in 1981 by Lerone Bennett called Listen to the Blood. And in it, he's highlighting this idea of like, what's even the reason, what's the meaning behind even studying this? What's the meaning behind Black history and its role in the world and who we are and what we tell ourselves. And it's really interesting when I read and looked at those 5 buckets. Number one, they're not just clear, separate from each other; they overlap one another. But one of them, which he highlights, which is the last one, is this idea that Black people have a role in transforming society, right? So the question then becomes, what stories are we telling ourselves and highlighting, and in which ways, right? And that's why I cringe every time someone mentions how Dr. King had an affair, right? Number one, I don't know how much I believe that. Coretta Scott King sweared up and down till she died. He didn't get down like that, but whatever. I ain't going to get into the argument of that. But emphasizing and highlighting those stories, I think, while also neglecting really where, King staying in a tenement building in Chicago to protest the conditions, right? In 1964. So like those type of things, those are the stories that need to be emphasized. And I can tell you right now, when students learn about those stories, that's where they perk up. Because no longer are you telling this like grand Western narrative. And that's how usually those major flashpoints are put in the context of within someone else's storyline. When you start to get into the thinking and the thought processes of our folks, we're the main subjects. Those ideas are the main subjects, and we're operating in a different realm.
So I want to ask you guys to do this real quick because I know we're going to have to wrap soon. But if I could get each of you to do 1 minute on, at this moment, at this time, what would a Black education radical do to make sense of the politics right now? What's our best play as that person? If you're talking to that person, what do you say to them right now in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things, but I think one is protect the children. And when I say protect the children, I don't mean just in the moment. I mean in their journey. Like, and so what do they need to know and aware? And I think one of the best things, and you said it earlier, sharing like the history of like how things have happened and how people have continued to push forward. Again, Black people being this unique space. That means if we've been that in the past and present, like constantly pushing this country to improve. And again, people are not saying only Black people, but we've always been in a central part in many of the movements to improve this country that started on just genocidal land grabs and profiteering. So we've been a central part of that story, as well as others, and teach about the others as well. But I think making sure that our youth understand the past, the present, and being able to visualize in the future. And that means policy, that means law, that means activism, that means literacy. Like it means a lot of different things. But I think, at the end, like how are we educating our youth in systems and outside of systems? How are we showing them there is a way? Because the last thing we need our youth to do is say, you know what, I give up. That's to me, that's the most fearful, like how this deluge and just like this constant threat. But we've been in constant threat before. There's even more, maybe, more violent, right now it's volatile. At that point, it was strictly violent. And yet people were pouring into the youth like, hey, your job is to continue this. Your job is, I sent y'all a thing, this teacher in San Francisco, math teacher. And she said, one of the things that she learned as a child that people are learning, it seemed like a lot of Americans waking up to now is like, the struggle doesn't end. You know what I mean? The struggle is just, how do you equip for the next ride, the next group, the next session? Because it's coming. Like, so as sure as the sun is up, another iteration is coming. So to me, that's pouring into that kind of space. And just to tie it back to what you said earlier, and it means not, we want to Clint Eastwood all of our heroes. The lone person on the plane, he defeated everybody. Like, don't Rambo our heroes, don't Clint Eastwood our heroes. Nah, they did it in community.
Sharif,
So that would
nobody's
be
gonna
the
know
other
who
part.
Rambo is, bro.
Are you serious? We
Yeah,
that
no one's
old?
gonna know.
We that old?
We that old. Nobody, because people right now are saying, Rambo?
What's Rambo?
What's a Rambo? Ish, what do you say right now? Your advertisement directly to a radical in this moment, how they be the most effective in this moment?
Well, number one, recognize that we already have the blueprint, and that's through our ancestors and the lessons they learned. So I definitely would encourage people to start study groups or book clubs with folks, whether you're talking about folks in your community, whether if you're an educator with other fellow educators. I would also say another piece would have to be is to join an organization in your local community that does the type of work that you feel is important, whether that's work against, the proliferation of war, the giant triplets that King talked about. Like any of those avenues, I say that's the best way to do, because really only through experience, only through theory practice, right, will people actually even start to develop things necessary in order to move forward. Because I sometimes listen to folks talk about what needs to be done and be like, I wonder if they ever, are they familiar with the work of so and so? You know what I mean? Because it seems like it's coming from a very ahistorical piece. When, like I said before, the blueprint, our ancestors already developed it. We just have to go back and retrieve it.
And, if I had to answer this question, I would say I always try to think in terms of process. I'm becoming way more about that now. So if I thought about this, I would say to young people right now, have a process for the way that you attack the issues of your day, of your time. There's going to be issues that are going to come up. You're going to have to deal with them. We're not going to always be around for this. It's your time now. So what I would say to you is always do three things. The first thing is analyze. So gather all the facts that you can about whatever issue it is that you're fighting, whether it is climate change or education or whatever. Gather the facts and do some analysis. Analyze those facts because you're going to do a fact-based of effort, no matter what, because if you do, that's going to be the strongest you can possibly be. Once you get all those facts on the table, you need to crystallize them. So you're analyzing for clarity, for understanding. You're crystallizing for planning purposes. Once you get the facts, what do you do with them? What are the most important ones that rise to the top? What are the ones that make it clear to you what the biggest issue or the biggest levers to pull are? Because that's what you need to get out of the facts. You need facts, but you need them to tell you, where should we put our energy? Where should we put our action? Like, what are the biggest levers we could pull? And then the third one is, so you analyze, which is gathering facts and all that, you crystallize. And then the third one's on my hat. Then you organize. See, organizing needs to be based on something. It needs to be based on something. I've joked and called this before infovism, informed activism, information and activism put together. We have a lot of people that have information. We have a lot of people that do activism. When those two people are not in touch with each other, you get informed inaction on one side and you get misinformed action on the other side. We need to put those together. So analyze, crystallize, and organize. If you do those three things, I think you will have a little process, a mini process for yourself of understanding. Should I be in the street right now doing this thing? Should I be joining this or that group? Because sometimes, this might help you understand. Do they have the facts? Are they really crystallizing things in a way that the community can understand and others? And are they organizing around the thing that they know? Because that's where you want to be. And that's where people, I think, whether it's gun violence, no matter what it is. Now, see, our producers said we got to come up with a new word for those three things. So stratacution, stratacution. Ladies and gentlemen,
said no more fake compound words in 2025.
Stratacution.
Strategy and execution.
This is what we got to do is stratacution. Brothers.
See, this is why we have no right to to tease when they were like, I'm manifesting and I'm doing, you know what I mean? This is why we really don't have no right to tease anybody, you know?
You know what? This is what I'm going to say is, you've said this and everybody say, if you want to wake up a sleeping people, what? You know, you got to fill in the blank with that. And we know people like Fannie Lou Hamer and others, the best thing that they ever did as leaders was make things plain, make them simple. King talked about his 5-step process. He had 5 steps, you know, starting with purification, like, you know, knowing that you're doing the thing for the right reasons. He also had a thing around gather the facts. And all of his process eventually got you to the point where you are boycotting Montgomery or whatever. But at least there was a little process that he would go through in his mind. But Fannie Lou Hamer and others had the biggest gift, I think, ever, is try and simplify these things for people when you talk about them. Don't give them 18 things to do. Don't give them a million steps and all this type of stuff. Make it as simple as possible, even when it's complex. And right now, for young people, for saying to you, I think the devil is complex. The devil makes things complex. The devil loves complexity. The devil loves confusion. The devil loves you being misguided and you being adrift and taken off your path. And if you are not a thoughtful, thinking, balanced person who understands how to wade through facts, you might get lost. And if you get lost, you might end up in a very bad way. That's what we've learned from our history. That's 100% what we've learned. Brothers, I appreciate you guys as always. I know we got a jump. And to everybody listening and watching, if there's anything that we talked about today in terms of a resource, a book, a reference, connect with us. Put some comments beneath our YouTube here. Also share it with others. If you think that there's anything that we said today that can be shared with others, please do share it with others. We appreciate you all as always, and we will see you on the next Freedom Friday show.